Howdy, folks, and welcome back to my harrowing account of one young, brave, megalomaniacal Austinite trying to control the minds of his fellow humans. And we'll find out what factors led to the demise of my ill-fated cult. How did it end? What happened? Why am I not living in some kind of compound in Oregon, guarded by fanatics with submachine guns while I walk out in golden robes to perform some sort of ritual? While some choir of fanatical following women praise me in song, and I walk out in golden robes to speak some precious words of wisdom, and then some sort of elaborate ritual is conducted. And somehow I end up richer. It turns out life didn't lead me down that path. Some people might say that a major tragedy was narrowly averted. People like my wife, who do a lot of research into cult leaders and some of the bad things that happen when bad men get a lot of power. In particular, she's interested in this guy named Jim Jones, who orchestrated a mass suicide in 1978 that led to the deaths of 900 people, many with a variety of levels of consent given. And a lot of people would look at a horrible situation like that and say, hey, that's what happens when you start cults. This is what cult leaders are like. This is the kind of fire you're playing with. Well, I reject that entirely. The problem with Jim Jones was not that he was a cult leader. It was that he was a bad cult leader. Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. One thing that this experience taught me is that humans require leadership. They thirst for leadership. I think a large portion of the rebellious people in the world are just people who were disappointed with the leadership that they received early on. There are people who, at some point in their lives, were willing to give the benefit of the doubt and devote their efforts to the power structure that they found themselves in. But at some point, it failed them. And so rebellion is not a statement that we don't need leadership. It's a rejection of the current leadership. It's saying, you know what, if this is the best kind of leaders that we can get, then let's just burn it all down and see what happens. But I do think that leadership is necessary for people, especially when they're young. And that's what's strange, is that leadership over young people is a particularly contentious issue when that's the most necessary kind of leadership. The effects that a lack of leadership has varies a lot depending on the person and their life circumstances. But there are definite patterns. Because they didn't get the proper leadership, some people end up dead at a young age, or they end up in prison. Some people don't get the leadership they need, and they do just fine. They survive their youth, but they slowly wither away into an anxious and lonely person that feels like they missed out on a lot of things. I think those are people who needed leadership and didn't get it. I think we all need it. And the weird thing is that I think a lot of us fight it. We fight that desire for leadership. And I think it's built into our culture. It's part of our American instinct toward self-direction. We want to pull on our own bootstraps. We don't want to tug on anyone else's cape. And many Americans develop a healthy distrust of government. and they make us overlook the importance of having a strong person who acts as a kind of traffic cop for today's busy marketplace of ideas. And if we think back to what Confucius said, the best leadership is not going to be found in the government. If the best leadership comes from the government, then you've got a serious problem. You definitely don't have a free society. And so our tendency to want to overlap government with other kinds of leadership is a problem because it's way too top down. It's more like ancient Egypt in the age of the pharaohs than a modern free society. In a modern free society, you have a variety of leaders exerting leadership over the arts or the sciences or households, the most important kind of leadership. Leadership over a classroom or a community or a baseball team. This stuff is important, and I think our society has neglected that role, and we're suffering the consequences of it. I think our society is suffering because we don't even know what leadership looks like anymore. We look at Jim Jones and we think, oh, that's a leader. And I have a terrible, terrible, dark, horrible thing to say. I'm going to lose a lot of listeners here because I think that there is someone to blame for our situation here. The fact that leadership in Western civilization now is in such a sad state, I'm going to have to lay that blame entirely on our doorstep. I think we did it. We don't have good leaders because we're terrible followers. Starting with the boomers, of course, and then Gen X. We have 2 generations of avowed rebels. People who couldn't wait to burn the system down and shake things up and be their own boss. Now, the problem is only some people can do that, and they really have to know what they're doing. Now, what do I mean by followship? Followship is the quality in a person that makes them want to follow a good leader. Followship is what makes somebody want to get up and do something another person says without being paid for it and without being shamed for doing it or not doing it and without having a gun pointed to their head. So when we lost followship, you're gonna lose leadership because good leaders require good followers. Otherwise, the guns have to come out. As an aside, some of you may know that I wrote a bad rough draft of a novel that was set mostly in 1880 in Colorado, in Leadville, Colorado. And the story hinges around silver mining and some people from New York who are coming to try to organize a silver miners union in that town. And there's a gentleman who talks about the importance of silver and lead in Western civilization. And he says that greed, here we're going back to Gordon Gekko again, but the character in my book waxes poetic about the beauty of greed and how it civilizes men. How men come out west looking for wealth, and that causes them to behave in good ways because you have to be temperate, you have to save your money. And so this character says that a greedy man is a good man because he's civilized. You can control a greedy man. The worst kind of man is a man who's not greedy, the man who's not material, because you can't move him with silver. as this character says. And if you can't move a man with silver, then you got to go to plan B. And that's when things get ugly. Plan B involves lead, i.e., threatening to punch holes in their body with fast-moving pieces of lead. So when this character is asked to sum up his position, he simply opens his waistcoat, shows the gun in his belt, and he says, "Silver is what civilizes a man, because if you can't move a man with silver, you gotta move him with lead." And so I think that's our problem. We want a society where people aren't bought with silver to do the right thing. And we want a society where people aren't threatened with lead to do the right thing. We need a society with good fellowship so that we don't have to do that stuff. And I think this connection between fellowship and leadership is important because fellowship is how you can tell when you've got a good leader. That's how you can single out the Jim Joneses of the world. That's how you can exclude them and protect society. How can we tell when someone's going to be a good leader, a real leader? And how can we tell when they're just going to be another abuser who just wants to figure out a way to marry a 14-year-old? Well, you look for fellowship. A good leader is a good follower, by definition, because usually all the leader is doing is following the will or the words of some other institution or being or dead person. It's that ability to take themselves out of it and say, hey, this isn't about me. This is about our project. This is about what we're aiming at. That's what real leadership is about. Not to direct people's attention to you, but toward some concrete, positive purpose. So, am I a good follower? Did I have what it took to avoid the Jim Jones problem? Well, I knew something was up with me from a very early age for a variety of reasons, and we don't have time to go into all of it, but here's one example. So I really, really loved that movie, The Karate Kid. And if you've never seen The Karate Kid, it's about a single mother who moves to this slightly frou-frou place in Southern California, and her son doesn't fit in very well. He gets picked on by the kids. He's, maybe a late bloomer, physically a little bit, kind of scrawny. And there are these guys, the Cobra Kai guys. And Cobra Kai was the name of a karate school in town that catered to young bullies, apparently. And the teacher was an absolute psychopath. He was like this screaming guy who liked to punch students and acted more like a drill instructor than some sort of nurturing teacher. And when I saw The Karate Kid, I was blown away, and I absolutely hated the main character, Daniel. I thought he was annoying and kind of a whiner. And I loved Cobra Kai. I loved the Cobra Kai school. I absolutely thought to myself, I've got to find a place like that. I want to follow an instructor like that. I had to wait a while, but finally, around 1990, during the peak of the Taekwondo craze, which came in partly, I suppose, due to the popularity of The Karate Kid, and, well, it's a long story that has to do with the fact that Taekwondo was more systematized by organizations in Korea, and they had a ready-made curriculum. A lot of this goes back to American occupation of South Korea starting in the 1950s. And there were logistical and organizational advantages that Taekwondo had over karate, which you could argue may have peaked in the 1960s, because by the 1970s, Kung Fu was running everything. Well, there were no cool Kung Fu schools near me, but luckily, I did eventually find Taekwondo Plus, a Taekwondo school in Beaumont, Texas. And I was working as a cook at Dairy Queen at the time. I had a little bit of extra money that I wanted to spend on some lessons. And I wasn't looking for a Mr. Miyagi. I wasn't looking for a gentle, soft-spoken Japanese man to teach me right from wrong and self-respect. I wanted a loud, angry, violent man to teach me how to kill. Very different proposition. When I went to check out the school, I was watching from the gallery through the glass. It was a white belt class, and the instructors were talking about the ki-hop, the yelling, and how important it is. It is very important for a lot of reasons, and, you know, I'm going to do, I guess, episodes on martial arts at some point, but these guys who weren't even in uniform, they were in the back row in the classroom. It was apparently like a trial class for them. And I could see that they were not taking things seriously. I saw this man who physically resembled the leader of the Cobra Kai school. He even had the salt and pepper hair and a jawline that you could use as a letter opener. This was Marvin Conway, and Mr. Conway was awesome. And they were kind of making a joke about yelling. They were not taking it seriously, and Mr. Conway kind of interrupts the instructor and goes up to the guys and explains to them that controlling your breathing is super important. And you find out also that it's extremely important, especially when you consider situations where you're going to be struck very hard in the abdomen or in the chest. That's going to make it difficult to control your breathing. Struck in the head makes it difficult to control everything. Very few people have been in a situation where someone that you are convinced is trying to hurt you is screaming as loud as they can in your face. It's a little unsettling. It takes you off your game just a little bit. And so these guys didn't understand that. And so Mr. Conway wanted them to breathe in right when he punched them in the gut. So they would be able to compare that to being punched while you're breathing out. And it's true. Getting hit while you're breathing out is infinitely better. Doesn't hurt nearly as much. It's weird. But obviously, right when this guy goes to take a deep breath, Mr. Conway socks him in his gut. The guy's face turns red, and they weren't laughing anymore after that. And I thought to myself, well, I'm in. I'm sold. So I joined that Taekwondo school, and I learned a lot. Aristotle said that all true learning is painful. Mr. Conway taught me quite a bit. In fact, to this day, anytime I pretend I'm punching or doing something with one hand, my other hand will always automatically kind of come up toward my face. I will always have both hands up. And it's such an instinct now because I thought I was super cool. And I watched every Bruce Lee movie, and I thought I couldn't be hurt. Now, it turns out that I might actually have a genetic quality that is related to my Haida ancestry that does make my bones significantly denser. And maybe that's one reason why I didn't get as injured as I totally should have been, given what I was doing. But while sparring, I would tend to throw wild techniques that I thought looked cool that weren't very practical. I wasn't taking getting hit very seriously. I wasn't keeping my hands up. And so Mr. Conway, between sparring rounds, would come in and say, hey, Lecornu, you need to keep your hands up. What's with this technique? He's trying to verbally let me know what I was doing wrong. But, I come in there with too many Dr. Peppers in me, and I want to show off. And so finally he had enough, and even though I was a blue belt at the time, for the next round, he grabs me and he's like, you're sparring with me the next round. Get over here. And so he puts his gear on, and I'm like, oh, this is not a good situation. And so the round starts, and Mr. Conway is just totally still. And he's like, come at me. Throw something. Do something. So I go in and try some simple side kick, that kind of thing. But the problem, of course, is I'm not paying attention to where my hands are. He immediately sidesteps my not very fast kick and just punches me right in the nose. Just boom. It's just that thing where you just see a flash. He may as well have just put a camera in my face and set off the flash. Next thing you know, I feel top of my lip is wet. My little pencil peach fuzz mustache was getting wet for some reason. So anyway, he had bloodied my nose, but what do you know? Habits are hard to break. And so I could not, even at that point where I was focusing on keeping my hands up, I would still let them down at certain times, and he'd hit me right in my nose. And so finally, I got the message. I was a better fighter after that one incident. So what does all this have to do with me starting a cult? Well, I think you can maybe see the pattern here. I've always been attracted to extremism, especially people who lead groups to do extreme things. I think a lot of us admire the man who sees the enemy at the top of the hill and grabs his weapons and charges up the hill to fight the enemy. I've always thought that there was also something special about the guy who could get 10 other men to follow him up the same hill also. That guy who spent the previous day studying the hill and the best ways to get up there. The guy who studied up on the culture and the logistical practices of the enemy who occupied the top of the hill, so that he'd know exactly where to hit him and how and when. I've always thought there was something special about that guy. The harder I saw him work on that plan, the more eager I was to follow him up that hill. I'd feel like I'd have the best chance of success. So I think the follower in me is what creates the leader in me. Because that's all you're doing is you're thinking, what would it take to convince me? What would get me up that hill? What would make me feel better about running up the hill with a gun? Who would I want to follow? How would they dress? How would they talk? There was a historian who looked at records left by the Union Army, and they noticed an important pattern where Union officers would plan important maneuvers and tactical changes based on the timing of their soldiers' coffee intake. Whether the soldiers had had their morning coffee or how long had it been since they'd had their coffee was taken into consideration when planning the timing of attacks or looking at when the enemy might choose to attack. Now, to me, that's good leadership. That's understanding your people, understanding the enemy. I talk about martial arts, which means basically talking about fighting, and I talk about war and also my childhood in this area because I think most of our most powerful instincts are formed around emotions that evolved to help us find resources to make tools and to work together to fight war. And this is weird, so hear me out. We have to rewind the tape way, way back, not to me as a young man in the 90s, taking fencing in Austin and taking it way too seriously and having the instructor become a little angry because I broke 2 foils on people. But let's face it, if that had been a real fight, those people would be skewered. That was a solid hit. And it's not my fault that his foils are weak. But anyway, we have to rewind past me in the 90s, past me with my G.I. Joes in the 1980s, back about 3 million years ago on the East African savanna. So now let's pretend that we are an Australopithecus afarensis. I'll say that again. Australopithecus afarensis. So picture it in your mind. You're a little under 4 feet tall, covered in fur, East African ape, don't have a tail, and you walk on 2 legs, upright, like a person. But for the most part, your facial features are very ape-like. You would be seen as some sort of chimp that escaped the rainforest. And you can't stray too far from forest cover. You're not like our original African human ancestors who didn't have fur and could sweat. Nope. You're not a hominin yet, so you can't sweat. You can't take the heat. You can't go around running. But one thing that you are doing is you're part of a population of Australopithecines who are starting to eat more and more meat. You're starting to wander out more from forest cover. You're starting to risk heat stroke to get food on the savanna. Long story short, you're evolving into a hominin. You're evolving into something more like Homo habilis, which was a tool-using creature, a hunter on the savanna. And so, as you're evolving to use tools and rely on them, you can't just develop new neurons to handle the new ideas. You have to develop new emotions. You have to be able to see the world in a different way. And more importantly, you have to feel the world in a different way. Because now we've got a new category of thing. Before you had stuff that doesn't matter, just background noise, and then threat, or food, or potential mate. Ooh, check her out. But now there's a new category of thing, a resource. Now in this case, in the case of this evolving Homo habilis, we're talking about flint. And the difference between flint and chert. And so chert is just a chalky white rock that you can't do much with other than pave country roads. But inside chert, you've got these huge lobes of black, shiny flint. And our ancestors not only had to learn the difference between flint and chert, I think something happened to them emotionally that was very important. All of a sudden, there were things in the world that weren't related to our life cycle, but needed to be noticed. As I said, they weren't predator or prey. They weren't poisonous. They weren't a potential mate or a biological relative that we needed to watch out for. Now, this was just a valued item, not just a rock or a chunk of dirt. I mean, it may look like it, but it's got something that ordinary rocks or ordinary dirt doesn't have. It has importance. Now, it's not important because you can eat it. You can't. And it's not important because you have to run from it. You don't. It's important because you're supposed to notice it and collect it and keep it, because you can utilize it later as a tool. There were some things in the world that you could do things with, where most things you couldn't. A handful of sand just could not give you the same utility as a nice, solid piece of flint. And I think this is the first step in a process that I'm trying to talk about, that I'm trying to explain. There's going to be a next step that we'll come back to. And then I think you'll be able to see how this relates to leadership and cults and why people want to start them and why people might want to join them. And it has to do with this idea of value or purpose. This idea that you can do thing B with thing A. There are some things that are important because they're useful. And of course, that's going to eventually extend to our thoughts about ourselves. Everyone at some point has to ask, am I more like Flint? Or am I more like Chert? How useful am I? And does that matter? Well, the early 2000s were a great time to live in Austin. Austin was exploding in population at the time, and all of us Gen X hipsters thought we ruled the roost, and every night was 80s night at the Highball. South Lamar was starting to turn into Walt Disney World, and South Congress was turning into some kind of strange tourist attraction. But I gotta say, there was a store on SoCo that sold leather goods, and I found this really cool replica of the wallet that Samuel L. Jackson's character owns in Pulp Fiction. And of course, we know the distinctive feature of that wallet is that it says "Bad Motherfucker" on it. And whoever made this, they got the stitching exactly right, the right color. It looked exactly like what they pulled out of the trash bag at the diner robbery scene at the end of the movie. But anyway, Craigslist was especially useful. Remember, back then, people were just now starting to be able to use their phones to organize meetups and get on Craigslist and that sort of thing. Only a couple of years before, unless you really shelled out money for a BlackBerry, you were pretty much stuck with using a desktop or a laptop. And so the group grew over that first spring and summer. And by grew, I meant we went from 1 or 2 people showing up. I never had a time when no one showed up. That would have been an especially tough blow to one's ego when you're trying to be a cult leader. What if someone threw a cult and no one showed up? But we would easily have 10 people show up. You could always count on enough people to have a good conversation. And that first spring and summer had really good weather. So we spent a lot of time at the parks. Mayfield Park, Zilker Park. We merged into a lot of drum circles. We had to dodge our way out of a lot of disc golf courses. But there was a problem coming. And some of you might remember that back in the early 2010s, it used to get cold. And not just the occasional weird blizzard, but actual autumnal type weather. And so, as of, say, October that first year, the parks weren't quite as convenient for meeting as they used to be. And so we started to gravitate to meet at lounges and bars like Trudy's or Opal Divines or Cover 3. I think they're still open. This, of course, changed the vibe a little bit. The meetings were a little bit louder. People were drinking alcohol. The ones who did. I would say the majority drank alcohol. Our Islamic friend chose to abstain, of course, when he did attend. But it didn't quite fit the meditative nature vibe that I was going for, or that I started to enjoy there during the summer. The meetings would feel healthy. When I came back from a meeting, I was getting tan, which for me means turning red, and staying red. I don't burn easily. Whenever I start to tan, my tan is pretty rusty colored. Gosh, I don't know why that would be. It definitely added more confusion for the people who thought that we were naturists. People who came for naturism were more confused by these fully dressed people hanging out drinking overpriced beer. We had a guest who said he was a comedian, and I don't know that we were the best audience, but he told a joke about, don't you hate it when you are pumping your gas at the same time as someone else on the same pump? And whenever they start their pump, you notice that your gas starts pumping more slowly, and that really angers you. And, yeah, it didn't go over. Didn't quite get it. But strangely, after the meeting, he sent me an email with a review of the meeting, and he said that he wouldn't be attending any more meetings because I wasn't nearly as funny as I thought I was. And I know that. I mean, things sound really funny in here in this skull. And then sometimes when they leave the skull, they're not quite as funny. But I can't help that. I mean, that's just nature. That's science. So, here's where we reached a pivot point. It started to get real cold, and I started to feel like we were just partying and hanging out. So I saw an ad for this thing that they used to have at the Alamo Draft House occasionally, called the Dionysium. The Dionysium, and that's Dionysium. Yes, it's a weird reference to a pagan ritual, an invocation to Dionysus. So I thought to myself, well, we've got to check that out. And I invited a couple of cult members to this show. And it was basically a 90-minute or so intellectual variety show that involved music, short films, lectures, talks, debates. And it started with a long, clever, poetic invocation to Dionysus. And you were strongly encouraged to drink wine, as much as you thought would be good for Dionysus during the show. And the core of the group were two guys that were a visual odd couple in the sense that they didn't match each other's vibe or appearance or height or dress style. The shorter, stockier guy was a red-haired gentleman with a nice full beard, And he was sort of the intellectual leader of the group. He was the one who recited the invocation and gave a couple of the talks. But he would also gladly hand over the stage to a variety of people, but he would always come back. Whenever he'd come back to the stage, he'd have a really cool comeback or some kind of tagline or summation of what just happened that was funny. So he kept his imprint on it. And I'm thinking, this guy's a good leader. Game recognizes game. Now his friend was a very tall, much more animated guy with long black hair. And he was from the theater. And he played a circus-style organ that they would wheel in and put in the corner. And that would be sort of the odd soundtrack to some of the things that were going on. Now, the philosopher type, who had the girlfriend who had cystic fibrosis, he really liked the Dionysium, and he would show up, and his girlfriend would come, but she was not a drinker, and she would often have to leave the theater to cough or administer medication or otherwise make noises, and so it probably wasn't her favorite activity. And so it wasn't long before I befriended the two hosts of the Dionysium, and after the show at the Alamo Draft House, they and their friends would meet at the Good Night, which I think might still be open. There is definitely still a lounge open at that location. But anyway, everyone would just line up and go over to the Good Night Lounge after the show at the Alamo Draft House, and there would be more drinking and more talking. And the conversation definitely was about philosophy or religion or science and where the three of them intersect or collide. So there was that element. We were sort of on topic, but there was still definitely even more of a party vibe. The group had grown, but there was definitely no focus, no meditative vibe. Now, I want to make it clear that I had no problem with the fact that I was not the big ego in charge. I got plenty of attention. I was fine. And all along, I'd always considered myself the facilitator rather than a lecturer or a dictator. So I let various circumstances determine what we were going to talk about or how long or mediating disagreements between members. I definitely wanted to foster a democratic type vibe rather than what was really going on, which is that I was absolutely in charge and they needed to know that. No, just joking. So now that I look back, I think the seeds of the ending of this whole project, this whole phase in my life, were planted right at the peak, right at a moment when I, at the time, felt that I had really come full circle, that maybe I had really stumbled onto something. And this was one particular Dionysium where one of the special guests was going to be Dr. Paul Woodruff. Now, Dr. Paul Woodruff is a classicist and a philosopher from UT Austin, and he was very instrumental in directing and planning the program that I was in. He was a professor of mine for one semester when I was a freshman, and I wouldn't say scared of him, but he was an imposing guy back then in the mid-90s. He was a Vietnam veteran, he was a Marine, and a lot of his Greek translations had been published. One of them was famous for having Elvis's mugshot on the cover, and that was his translation of Bacchae. He was this tall, physically imposing guy, and I remember when he was teaching the course that I had to take from him, Problems in Knowledge and Valuation. That was the name of the course. So you can imagine how fun that was. But here at this Dionysium, Dr. Woodruff would be participating in a debate. He was debating the existence of moral luck. Does moral luck exist? In other words, are some people good because they were lucky? And are there people that we can look at and say, they're not really evil, they were just put in really bad situations? And of course, as a combat veteran of Vietnam, Dr. Woodruff has special experience in this sort of thing because of the things that he had seen during his combat tour. And so I was looking forward to this debate. And when Dr. Woodruff comes out on stage, it was a little upsetting because he had clearly gotten ill and he was kind of stooped over and he just was not the physically imposing person that I remember from 15 years ago. He did well in the debate, of course. It was fascinating. And I was very excited to see that he decided to show up at the good night to talk with us after the show at the Alamo Drafthouse. He, of course, remembered me. We had had lunch together back when I found out later they were deciding whether or not to ask me to leave the program because I was taking too long to finish my undergrad thesis, which I was supposed to write. That's a long story. But anyway, I had been a thorn in his side for a while. And here I am with my entourage of younger people. And the philosopher acolyte of mine decides to just completely tear into Dr. Woodruff and starts grilling him about logical mistakes that he thinks that Dr. Woodruff made during the debate. It was a very strange position because I'm standing next to Dr. Woodruff and seeing him calmly listening to this guy trying to take on his logic. He just seemed so frail. Like all of the strength, the imposing quality that he had before was gone. And I admired, of course, how patient he was with my philosopher companion. And while they were talking, I had a chat with his girlfriend. And it all sort of struck me, not very verbally or explicitly at the time, but I think emotionally, at the end of the night, I started to doubt my mission. It struck me that that young woman had zero interest in the semantics of the logical arguments for or against the morality of combat atrocities committed during Vietnam. She wanted to hear something comforting that would help her deal with what she was facing, with the prospect of an early death, with extreme physical discomfort, and all the unfairness of life that her condition reminds us of. I think societies do their best to paint a thin veneer of fairness over the ugly chaos of nature. Life is a genetic lottery. Life is a sport where half the battle is won the moment you're conceived, because the social status of your mother and father matters a great deal, along with whatever biological gifts or curses that they gave you along with their DNA. And so these were the seeds that started inching us toward the end of the project. And another thing that started to rear its ugly head was, I guess for lack of a better word, gender issues. And so some of the people who participated in my group were also members of other groups, and some of them were part of this group called Atheism Plus. Well, actually, they were a faction of the ACA, the Atheist Community of Austin, who were dedicated to Atheism Plus, which is essentially, I guess, atheism plus a certain level of social justice concerns. And one of the problems that the atheist groups had for a long time is that they were overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. So what was happening was that the Atheism Plus people started to notice that my group was also overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. And I tried to stay out of that as much as possible. I actually had to hear about a sexual harassment incident that happened at an atheist conference where a gentleman allegedly harassed a woman in an elevator, and I was asked about my opinion on the matter during one of our meetings, and I had a very difficult time explaining to them how little I cared about any of this stuff. The guy in question, he had one joke that he made that I thought was funny. He would tell people that his parents wanted to name him Jew, but that wasn't Jewish enough. And so they settled for David Silverman. His name is David Silverman, and he's Jewish, and that's a very stereotypical Jewish name. And so I don't know the first thing about this guy, and, didn't really care. Now, another guy who was accused of being sexist or something was a guy who also happens to be Jewish. I don't know if that means anything, but Sam Harris. And he's a neurologist and philosopher. And he became a sort of famous atheist by writing books about atheism. But then he made a lot of atheists angry because at a conference, he gave a talk about how atheism shouldn't even really be a word because it's not really a belief system. It's just saying no to somebody else's beliefs. And he's exactly right. And so he's sort of like, we're all just sort of yelling no at the people next door, but what are we coming up with? What are our ideas? So I thought that was interesting. I also liked that Sam Harris used his philosophy chops to write a pretty good treatise on the moral dangers of deception. He makes a good case that there are no such thing as a white lie, that all deception is evil, unless you're sort of at war with that person. So spying or using deception during warfare is a different story. But within a society, and especially within a family or within good human relationships, there's really no place for deception. I was impressed by the strength of his reasoning there. But one thing I've always noticed is that I've always tended to have close friends who were very religious. And one thing I had come to conclude is something I had noticed in the years before. A lot of my closest friends have always been very religious people, and I just never seemed to have a problem with having discussions with or arguing with or being friends with people who have strong, specific religious beliefs. But for some reason, the people with extreme non-religious beliefs tend to have an issue with me. For some reason, I can have friends on the far end of the religious belief spectrum, but people on the extreme atheist side, or people on the very far left, tended to have an instinct to want to just leave the group or discard me entirely when disagreements arose. I found that interesting, that in the marketplace of ideas, in the huge mosh pit of society, I was getting chest bumped and pushed toward the religious end of the spectrum just by asking these questions. Well, we'll have to continue the story of the dissolution of the group in Volume 3, our final volume, where we'll talk more philosophy. We'll also talk about what did I start doing instead of that group? What filled that void? It's funny, thinking back on my life to write the script for this episode, I was thinking, I did the same thing everyone else did in the 2010s. Like everyone else, at first I was charmed and excited and fascinated with the idea of being able to communicate and organize with people so easily. But then the pressure of dealing with lots of people in a group who may not agree on things started to take its toll, and I realized how valuable an hour of silent solitude can be. I also started to network. I met people through the Dionysium crew that started to give me some ideas. And long story short, I used Craigslist to make money instead of trying to find God or community or meaning or purpose. Who needs that stuff? It was the 2010s. People needed money. Things were getting more expensive. Back then, there was this idea that capitalism could still work. And so all you needed was 3 or 4 more side hustles, and you could get those bills paid. You could make those ends meet. Just suck in your gut, you know? So I dove into the new technologies and the new ways of connecting with people, and I ended up spending the next 10 years doing freelance editing of various types and also photography. And my aversion to doing newborn or maternity or wedding photography eventually led me to the world of fashion photography. That's strange. So we'll have to cover that in the last volume. We'll also talk about my last big hurrah with the Dionysium crew before they called it quits. And it was a debate that I participated in. It was a debate about, was Bruce Lee's death an accident or was it murder? Was it covered up? There's a long story behind how that got planned and how that turned out. And we'll talk about all that next time in Volume 3. We'll also talk about my thoughts about the next cult that I'm going to start. And when I have more time and resources, I'm going to come back with a vengeance. It'll be a lot more like Fight Club, but with some big exceptions, and we'll talk about that, so don't get nervous. But anyway, stay tuned for Volume 3, where I'll sum things up, and I'll talk more about what I've concluded about life and meaning, and we'll go back to the African savannah, and we'll find out the end of that story, the evolution of meaning. What does meaning mean? I do think it has a lot to do with that flint, and we're going to come back to that. So until then, I'll talk to you later.